Welcome to a Moment in Time podcast. I'm your host, Eric.
And I'm Freya. So I want you to imagine for a second, just picture that it's August 14th, 1961. You live in Berlin.
Right. Just a completely normal day.
Exactly. You go to sleep in your apartment, maybe you read a book, turn off the lamp, everything is completely fine.
Yeah.
But while you're sleeping, literally thousands of soldiers and construction workers just, descend on the city streets under the cover of darkness.
It's wild to even think about.
It really is. They start tearing up the asphalt with pneumatic drills. They're rolling out miles of razor wire, sinking concrete posts into the ground right through the middle of your neighborhood.
Just severing the city.
Yeah. So you wake up on the morning of August 15th, you look at your window and you realize that overnight, your city has been chopped in half. You're completely trapped. I mean, you went to sleep in a free society and you woke up in a prison.
It's terrifying. Mostly because it was just so sudden. Like the East German government threw up the Berlin Wall with almost zero warning. And, when we think about a wall like that, there is this expectation of, I guess, absolute brutal certainty. You're either on the inside or you're on the outside.
We're trapped or you're free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a very clean architectural binary reality. Yeah. Just made of concrete and rebar.
Right, but I think when you step back and look at the vast landscape of ancient history and biblical theology, that clean binary line gets incredibly complex.
Oh, for sure. It gets very muddy.
Yeah, because we start looking at walls not just as physical fortifications made of stone or, barbed wire, but as massive, living, spiritual metaphors.
That's the key.
Yeah.
Throughout human history, and especially within the biblical narrative, walls have this profound duality.
Right.
Like, yes, they are physical barricades designed to keep invading armies out, but they're also potent spiritual symbols. They represent the boundaries of human morality, the unity of a community, and sometimes, the perilous self-inflicted division between humanity and God.
And that duality is exactly what we're going to explore today. So welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today's stack of documents takes us deep into a really specific theological framework. We're going to examine the history of the world's most famous walls, but specifically through the lens of Christian conservative theology.
Which is a fascinating perspective to look through.
It really is. We're going to look at how the builders of these structures and the prophets who wrote about them viewed their world, both physically and spiritually.
Yeah, we are going to excavate ancient ruins in the Middle East. We're going to map out the architectural footprint of King Solomon's royal palace.
Oh, that part is so cool.
It is. And we'll examine these bizarre apocalyptic maps drawn by medieval monks who were, frankly, terrified of the end of the world.
Seriously terrified.
Right. And then we'll trace the history of the Roman frontiers all the way up to the fall of the Iron Curtain.
So the goal for us today is to decode the mechanics of these walls, like how they were actually built and destroyed, and figure out what those physical stones can teach us about our own internal spiritual defenses today.
Sounds like a solid mission.
Yeah. So to start this off, we have to rewind the clock to the end of the Bronze Age. We need to talk about arguably the most famous wall in all of ancient history.
The one that specifically did not stay standing.
Exactly. We are heading to es-Sultan, or, in biblical terms, the ancient city of Jericho.
Wow, Jericho.
Let's set the scene based on the book of Joshua, chapter 6. So, the Israelites have just crossed the Jordan River. They're beginning the conquest of Canaan.
And this isn't just a minor skirmish.
No, not at all. This is their first major military engagement as a unified people entering this new land. And Jericho isn't just some casual, unprotected village.
Far out from it. When we look at the historical and archaeological context of a Bronze Age Canaanite city, we are talking about a heavily fortified, highly strategic military choke point.
Right.
Jericho was built on a tell, which is basically an artificial mound created by generations of previous settlements. This gave it a massive high ground advantage.
So they're looking down on anyone approaching.
Exactly. The king of Jericho had ordered the city gates tightly shut, barred, and heavily guarded because, the entire region was terrified of the approaching Israelite army.
And they were completely prepared for a siege, too, because a siege in the ancient world was usually this brutal waiting game.
Yeah, just starving people out.
Right. The attacking army surrounds the city and just tries to starve the inhabitants to death.
Yeah.
But Jericho was in an incredibly strong defensive position.
They really were. Archaeologists have found that the town was fully stocked from a recent spring harvest.
Wow.
Yeah, massive earthen jars filled to the brim with grain have been uncovered in the ruins. And more importantly, Jericho had an in-house water supply.
The Spring of Elisha, right.
Exactly, located right inside the city walls. So they had water, they had food, and they had the high ground.
So from a purely military standpoint, they could just sit back, lock the gates, and wait for the Israelites to just, run out of supplies or die of exposure in the desert heat.
That would be the logical strategy.
But the siege they prepared for never happens, because Joshua receives what has to be one of the most bizarre military strategies ever recorded.
It completely defies all conventional military logic.
Seriously. God doesn't give him blueprints for battering rams or siege towers. He basically gives him a marching band routine.
Yeah, pretty much.
God commands the entire Israelite army to march around the city walls once a day for 6 days. But there's a catch. They have to do it in complete dead silence.
Not a single word.
They are led by 7 priests blowing ram's horns, the shofars, and they are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the physical manifestation of God's presence.
So you just have this eerie sound of thousands of marching feet and the blast of the horns.
Just that for 6 days.
Mhm.
Then on the 7th day, they march around the city 7 times. The priests blow a massive sustained blast on the horns. Joshua commands the army to shout, and the walls literally collapse flat into the earth.
And the specific moment, the collapse of the walls is where biblical theology and modern archaeology have traditionally clashed a lot.
Really? How so?
Well, for a long time, the walls of Jericho were considered a massive Bible problem in secular academic circles.
Oh, because some scholars argued that the city didn't even exist at the time the Bible says Joshua was there. Right.
Yeah, exactly. They wrote the whole narrative off as nationalist propaganda, like something invented centuries later by the kings of Judah to justify their territorial claims.
Wait. Let's pause there and explain stratigraphy real quick, because it's basically the absolute backbone of how we understand this timeline.
Sure.
How exactly do dirt layers prove when a wall fell down?
Okay, so think of a historical tell, like the mound Jericho sits on, as a massive ancient layer cake.
The lay cake, okay.
Right. When a city in the ancient world was destroyed, whether by fire, earthquake, or war, the survivors, or the conquerors, usually didn't have the heavy machinery to haul all the rubble away.
They couldn't just rent a dump truck.
Exactly. So they just flattened the debris and built the new city directly on top of the old one. Over thousands of years, this creates distinct layers of dirt, ash, and architecture. Stratigraphy is just the science of reading those layers from top to bottom. The deeper you go, the further back in time you travel. And you can date these layers by the specific styles of pottery found within them.
Because pottery styles changed like modern fashion trends, right?
Exactly. So when archaeologists like John Garstang and Kathleen Kenyon dug their trenches into this layer cake at Jericho, they found undeniable evidence of a massive cataclysmic destruction in the Bronze Age layer.
Wow. And they found those jars full of grain you mentioned earlier.
Yes, charred by a massive citywide fire. But what Kenyon found regarding the fortification walls themselves is absolutely stunning.
What was it?
As she dug into the lower retaining wall of the city, she described finding what she called the main collapse.
And what I love about this is the specific material of that collapse. She didn't just find random stones. She found red mud bricks.
Yes. The Canaanites had built a massive stone retaining wall at the base of the hill. And on top of that stone wall, they built a towering wall made of sun-dried red mud bricks. Kenyon found those red mud bricks, but they weren't on top of the stone wall anymore. They had fallen down the steep slope of the hill, coming to rest at the base of the retaining wall.
And this is where the physical dirt perfectly overlays with the biblical text.
It really is.
Because Joshua 6.2 explicitly says that after the walls fell, the Israelites went up into the city, every man straight before him. The collapsed wall of red mud bricks didn't just crumble inward, it fell outward and literally created a ramp.
A literal ramp of debris.
Yeah, a ramp that allowed the Israelite infantry to walk straight up the incline, over the stone retaining wall, and directly into the city.
It's amazing. Every single aspect of the biblical story that could possibly be verified by physical archaeology is verified right there in the dirt.
That's incredible.
The full grain jars prove the siege was short and happened right after the spring harvest, exactly as the book of Joshua claims. The burned ash layer proves the city was intentionally burned after the walls fell.
Which, again, matches the biblical account that they set the city on fire.
Exactly. And there's also the mechanism of the collapse itself to consider. Both Garstang and Kenyon noted that the specific way the bricks fell and the fault lines in the earth strongly indicated localized earthquake activity.
Because the Jordan Valley is situated right on a massive fault line, right?
Right, which brings up a really fascinating theological point regarding miracles.
Okay, let's hear it.
From a Christian conservative viewpoint, if God used a localized, naturally occurring tectonic event like an earthquake to accomplish his purposes that day, it doesn't make the event any less miraculous.
Yeah, the miracle isn't necessarily the suspension of natural law, it's the divine timing and precision.
Exactly. The earthquake happened at the exact second the people shouted.
Okay.
Or the structural collapse was highly specific.
Oh, you mean with Rahab's house?
Yes. The biblical text notes that Rahab, the Canaanite woman who hid the Israelite spies, lived in a house that was literally built into the city wall.
And her house survived the collapse.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I want to focus on the psychology of the Israelites for a second, specifically those 6 days of silence.
It must have been intense.
Seriously, put yourself in the sandals of an Israelite soldier. You're armed for battle, your adrenaline is pumping, but you are ordered not to utter a single sound.
Just absolutely silence.
Yeah, you just walk, stare at these massive, impenetrable walls, and listen to the horns. It's a massive psychological test. It's like the agonizing tension of a ticking clock in a thriller movie, but stretched out over nearly a week.
It was a profound test of discipline, for sure. But more importantly, from a theological perspective, a test of faith.
Right.
And this is the core spiritual application extracted from this historical event.
Mm.
The physical walls of Jericho fell primarily because of radical obedience to God's precise instructions.
Regardless of how illogical those instructions seem to human military strategy.
Exactly. The writer of Hebrews in the New Testament sums it up perfectly in chapter 11, verse 30. Says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days."
So it wasn't the acoustic resonance of the horns that shattered the bricks.
No.
And it wasn't the military prowess of the army. It was their faith, demonstrated through obedience, that invited God's intervention.
This connects beautifully to a broader biblical principle found in Zechariah chapter 4, which speaks of God's power to flatten seemingly insurmountable mountains into level ground.
Yeah.
The theological lesson for the listener here is deeply personal. You know, what walls currently stand in the way of God's best for your life?
That's a great question.
The historical framework suggests that walking in obedience to God's commands, even when those commands don't align with modern sensibilities or human logic, is the mechanism that brings down barriers.
Obedient faith is the catalyst for the collapse.
Well said.
So from a wall that God miraculously flattened into the dirt, we move forward in history to a wall that God specifically commanded a leader to rebuild from the ashes.
Right. Shifting gears completely.
Yeah, we are shifting from Joshua's Bronze Age conquest to the era of the Persian Empire, roughly the 5th century BCE. We are going to Jerusalem.
The walls of Jerusalem have this incredibly dense, layered history. I mean, parts of modern-day Jerusalem have been walled in since at least the age of Abraham.
Back when the Jebusites controlled the city, right?
Right. They called it Jebus. King David later conquered that fortress, making it his capital, and then his son, King Solomon, significantly expanded the fortification walls, fulfilling a vision of security that David had actually prayed for.
Just to give our listeners a sense of scale, because it's easy to imagine, like, a quaint little stone fence.
Oh, it's definitely not a fence.
We are talking about monumental architecture. Today, the Old City Wall of Jerusalem is about 2.5 miles long. It has an average height of almost 40 feet. It is 8 feet thick, and it boasts over 30 massive watchtowers and 8 imposing gates.
It is a sprawling fortress designed to withstand massive imperial armies.
But the specific era we're focusing on now is the time of Nehemiah. This is much later than Solomon.
Right, centuries later, the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar had besieged Jerusalem, completely destroying the city, burning the temple to the ground, and tearing down those massive walls.
And the people of Judah were taken into exile in Babylon.
Yeah. Eventually, under Persian rule, some exiles were allowed to return, but the city was largely just a graveyard of burnt rubble.
And this is where Nehemiah enters the narrative. He is a high-ranking Jewish official serving as the cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes in Susa.
He's living in absolute luxury.
Right. But he gets a report from some travelers that the returned exiles in Jerusalem are in great distress and that the walls of the city are still completely broken down and the gates are burned.
And Nehemiah's reaction sets the stage for one of the greatest organizational leadership case studies in ancient history.
It really is a masterclass.
He eventually gets permission and funding from the Persian king to travel to Jerusalem and lead a massive rebuilding effort. and the logistics of what he accomplishes are staggering.
Tell me about it.
He mobilizes a demoralized, impoverished population to rebuild these massive fortification walls in just 52 days.
Let's just pause and think about the sheer physics of that. 52 days. They are moving thousands of tons of ashlar masonry.
Massive rectangular cut stones.
Yeah, and they're clearing mountains of charred debris without bulldozers or cranes. They are sourcing massive timber beams for the gates.
All by hand.
All by hand, while under the constant, agonizing threat of military attack from surrounding hostile governors who wanted to keep Jerusalem weak.
Like you said, it's a masterclass in leadership. When you analyze this rebuilding project from a structural and spiritual standpoint, several profound principles emerge.
What's the first one?
The first critical lesson is about defining reality and simplicity.
Which is so rare today. Usually when a leader steps into a failing organization, there's this instinct to put a positive spin on everything, toxic positivity.
Exactly. But when Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, he didn't sugarcoat the ruin. He didn't immediately hold a pep rally.
Yeah.
In fact, he didn't tell anyone what he was planning. He took a secret ride on horseback in the middle of the night, navigating through the rubble by moonlight, just to visually assess exactly how horrific the damage was.
He had to see it for himself.
Right. He needed to comprehend the full scale of the catastrophe.
I love the quote by the systems scientist Peter Senge that often gets applied to this concept. He said, "Nothing is more limiting to a group than the inability to talk about the truth."
That's a great quote.
If you can't admit that the wall is completely destroyed, you can never begin to lay the first brick.
Precisely. Nehemiah defined the grim reality to the civic leaders. He finally stood before them and said, basically, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins.
He forced them to look at the ash.
Yes. But then he immediately transitioned that stark reality into a brilliantly simple vision. God's visions tend to be simple.
Yeah, humans build incredibly complicated systems.
But divine direction is often remarkably straightforward. For Nehemiah, the vision was 3 words: rebuild the wall.
And you have to imagine there were 1,000 other desperate problems in Jerusalem at that time. There was severe economic poverty, there was religious apathy, broken families, failing crops.
A lot of issues.
But Nehemiah knew that without a wall, without a physical boundary of security, none of those internal societal needs could ever be safely addressed.
The wall was the prerequisite for all other flourishing, which leads to the second major lesson: team building and purpose.
Right.
Nehemiah knew he couldn't accomplish this massive logistical feat with just a small crew of professional stonemasons. The vision was too big, and the 52-day timeline was too tight.
So what did he do?
He decentralized the labor. He expanded the team to include virtually everyone: priests, perfume makers, goldsmiths, merchants, even daughters of district rulers.
And the brilliant part is how he organized them. He didn't just assign people randomly.
No, he was very strategic.
He had families build the specific sections of the wall that were directly adjacent to or right in front of their own homes.
The psychology behind that is incredibly powerful. You are going to build a wall much thicker, much higher, and with far more care if it is the specific section of stone that stands between an invading army and your own living room.
Yeah, it completely personalized the labor.
But it wasn't really just about the physical bricks and mortar, was it?
No, and that's the crucial turning point. The physical wall was just a means to an end. What Nehemiah and the people were actually doing was reclaiming their identity as a distinct people of faith.
Right.
The physical structure was necessary for their survival, but what was truly at stake was their ancient covenant with God. Because their back-breaking physical labor was tied to this massive transcendent spiritual purpose, they didn't break down when adversity hit.
And the adversity was intense. The surrounding governors, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, they used every psychological warfare tactic available.
Oh yeah, they mocked the builders, saying that if a fox walked on the wall, it would crumble.
And when mockery failed, they threatened a surprise military massacre. When that failed, they tried to spread false rumors that Nehemiah was planning a rebellion against the Persian king.
They were just trying to manufacture fear to halt the progress. But Nehemiah's response was legendary.
He armed the workers. Half held spears, while the other half carried stones.
And when he was invited to come down from the wall for a quote-unquote peace conference that was actually an assassination plot, Nehemiah sent a message saying, "I am doing a great work and I cannot come down."
He absolutely refused to be distracted.
Okay, I want to back up to the very beginning of this story, though. Because before the 52 days of labor, before the midnight ride through the rubble, before he even spoke to the king, there was a foundational mechanism that started this entire process.
Ah, yes.
And from a Christian conservative perspective, it is the most vital and perhaps the most difficult step for us to replicate today.
You were talking about the mechanism of concern.
Right. When Nehemiah first heard the report in Susa that the walls were broken down, he didn't just shake his head, say that's a shame, and go back to his luxury.
Yeah.
The biblical text says he sat down and wept. He mourned, he fasted, and he prayed for days. He was in profound physical distress over the state of his people.
And we really need to pay close attention to the content of those prayers. In the ancient world and often today, people pray for their own immediate needs.
Sure, health, finances, stuff like that.
Exactly. Nehemiah wasn't praying for any of those things. He was weeping in agonizing repentance over the broken spiritual condition of his nation. He was carrying the weight of their spiritual failure.
So here is the question that I grapple with. How does a leader generate that level of intense, weeping concern in a populace that has grown completely apathetic?
It's incredibly hard.
The people living in Jerusalem had been living in those burnt ruins for decades. It had become normal to them. They were completely desensitized to the rubble.
And that desensitization is exactly what this historical account challenges within the modern listener.
How so?
Well, the Apostle Paul writes in Romans 15.4 that everything written in the past was written to teach us. Therefore, Nehemiah's physical, literal wall building is intended to serve as a direct blueprint for spiritual wall building in your own life today.
Oh, wow. So it's a mirror being held up to our own apathy.
Yes, the theological challenge here is pointed. Are you actually distressed about the broken spiritual walls in your own life? Have you ever wept over the haphazard, lazy way you might be handling your family's spiritual development?
Or are you genuinely concerned about the moral decay of your community? Or do you just, sit comfortably in the rubble, scroll on your phone, and complain about it?
Exactly. And the challenge extends to the concept of fasting, which Nehemiah utilized.
Right.
Modern Western culture largely ignores fasting or views it only as a dietary health trend. But the spiritual mechanism of fasting is about sacrifice to create space for God.
So the framework asks, do you need to fast from television, from doom-scrolling social media, from constant entertainment?
Are you willing to sacrifice that comfortable leisure time to aggressively rebuild your spiritual defenses through prayer and biblical study?
The underlying premise is that God moved the heart of a pagan Persian king to fund this project because Nehemiah's concern was genuine, sacrificial, and desperate.
Yes. If you are content to live in the ruins of weak spiritual boundaries, the rebuilding process will never begin. The first stone laid is always deep personal conviction.
So Nehemiah was desperate to restore the legacy of the Davidic kings. He was essentially rebuilding the outer perimeter that protected the footprint of what David and Solomon had originally established centuries earlier.
Right.
But that raises a fascinating historical and architectural question. What did that original royal compound, the First Temple period Acropolis that Nehemiah was trying to protect, actually look like?
To understand the sheer scale and design of this ancient seat of power, we have to turn to modern archaeology.
Okay, let's do it.
Specifically, the findings of prominent archaeologists like David Ussishkin, who has done extensive work reconstructing the layout of Jerusalem during the 8th century BCE.
This is the era of King Hezekiah, right?
Yes, right around the time the terrifying Assyrian military machine under King Sennacherib was marching across the Middle East.
Got it.
It's vital to understand the topographical map of Jerusalem here, because it is not built on a flat plain. The geography dictates the defense.
Right.
By the 8th century BCE, Jerusalem had expanded into a massive, sprawling metropolis, largest in the Kingdom of Judah. It covered two major hills.
Okay, what were they?
First, the southeast hill, which is the original ancient city of David, hugging the vital Gihon Spring. Second, it had expanded onto the much larger southwest hill, a newer residential and commercial quarter, often referred to in biblical texts as the Mishnah, or second quarter.
And all of this lower city was wrapped in a massive, thick, defensive wall. But towering above all of this residential sprawl was the Temple Mount.
Right. The Temple Mount was the royal Acropolis. It was the absolute nerve center of the kingdom, housing both the religious epicenter, the Temple of Yahweh, and the political epicenter, the royal palace of the king.
And this entire upper compound was enclosed by its own massive secondary wall, creating a fortress within a fortress.
Exactly. It was situated at the very northern edge of the city.
Which makes sense defensively. I mean, defending this Acropolis was largely about using the terrifying natural terrain to your advantage.
Absolutely.
On three sides, the east, the south, and the west, the Temple Mount was protected by incredibly steep plunging slopes that dropped violently down into the Kidron and Tyropian galleys.
You couldn't roll a siege tower up those cliffs if you tried.
Not a chance. But as with all ancient fortresses, there was a weak point.
There is always a topographical Achilles heel.
Always.
On the northwestern side, the Temple Mount didn't have a steep valley. Instead, it was connected to a neighboring higher hill by a topographical saddle, essentially a natural flat land bridge.
So an invading army could just march right across that saddle and assault the walls of the Acropolis directly.
Right. So how do ancient engineers defend a natural land bridge?
Good question.
The answer was found back in the 19th century by two British explorers and surveyors, Charles Wilson and Charles Warren.
Oh, I've heard of them.
Yeah, they were mapping the subterranean features of the Temple Mount, surveying the exposed bedrock near that northwestern saddle. And they found clear evidence of a monumental feat of ancient engineering.
What did they find?
A massive, deep ditch, or moat, cut straight into the solid limestone bedrock, completely severing the land bridge.
Try to conceptualize the labor involved in that. We're talking about the Iron Age. They didn't have dynamite or heavy excavation machinery.
No, not at all.
To cut a moat into solid bedrock, workers had to use iron chisels, bronze tools, and this crazy technique called fire setting.
Yeah, fire setting is intense.
They would build massive fires on the bedrock to heat it, then douse it with cold water to crack the stone inch by grueling inch.
It would have taken years of manual labor to carve out a ditch deep and wide enough to stop a siege engine.
And Ussishkin points out that this specific architectural defensive design, a rectangular royal compound built on a raised podium, placed at the edge of a city, and defended on its vulnerable side by a massive rock-cut moat, was not actually a homegrown Israelite invention.
No, it represents a widespread architectural technology imported from the north.
Really?
Yeah, archaeologists find this exact same royal blueprint in the massive palaces built by the Omride dynasty in the northern kingdom of Israel, at sites like Samaria and Jezreel.
Okay.
And if you go even further north, into eastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, you find the exact same thing in the Urartian fortresses. Sites like Lower Anzaf and the Citadel of Van are built as these elongated, sausage-shaped fortresses on high ridges, deliberately separated from the rest of the mountain by immense rock-cut defensive ditches.
Okay, so let's say you cross the rock-cut moat, you breach the gates of the Acropolis wall, and you are inside the royal compound. What are you looking at?
Well, most people assume the temple dominated the space, but Ussishkin theorizes that when Solomon originally built this complex, the royal palace was actually the primary dominant structure.
Wow, really?
It was significantly larger than the temple. The biblical text indicates Solomon spent 7 years building the temple, but 13 years building his palace complex.
That's a huge difference.
Over the centuries, as the spiritual significance of the site grew and the monarchy eventually fell, the temple became the sole focus of history, and the footprint of the massive palace was largely forgotten.
So where was the palace?
Ussishkin suggests the palace was likely located on the slightly lower ground, just to the north or south of the temple, integrated directly into the defensive walls of the Acropolis.
Let's get into the interior design of this palace, because this is where the archaeology gets incredibly vivid. 1 Kings chapter 7 gives us a highly detailed, room-by-room description of King Solomon's palace.
It wasn't just one house.
No, it was a sprawling complex with a ceremonial wing, private residential quarters for the king and his Egyptian wife, and an enormous armory and treasury called the House of the Forest of Lebanon.
Named because of the sheer amount of massive cedar pillars holding up the roof.
Exactly. Now, the ceremonial wing is of particular interest. The Bible describes an impressive entrance hall featuring a massive portico, basically a porch with large columns.
Right.
This entrance led directly into a monumental throne room, famously called the Hall of Judgment, where the king would hear legal cases and receive foreign dignitaries.
And when architectural historians look at that specific layout, a columned portico leading directly into a broad throne room where the throne sits on a raised dais against a side wall, they immediately recognize it.
What is it?
It perfectly matches a highly specific, very famous contemporary Syrian architectural style known as the Bit Hilani.
The Bit Hilani.
Yes, the Bit Hilani was the absolute height of royal luxury and power projection in the ancient Near East. A prime excavated example of this architecture was found at Tel Halaf in northern Syria.
Dating back to when?
The 10th and 9th centuries BCE, exactly the era of the biblical kings.
Hmm.
When you walked into a Bit Helani palace, you were meant to be overwhelmed by the wealth and scale of the empire.
And the specific aesthetic details in the biblical text map flawlessly onto what archaeologists have dug up in these Syrian palaces.
It's uncanny.
First Kings says Solomon's Hall of Judgment was paneled in cedar from the floor to the ceiling. Cedar was incredibly expensive, imported from Lebanon, famous for its rich color and scent.
And archaeologists have found the exact same style of high-end wood paneling in the Bit Helani palace of an Aramean king named Barricades at Zincirli in southern Turkey.
Wow. The biblical text also provides this fascinating, cozy little detail about the climate control of these massive stone rooms.
Yes, in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 36.
The prophet describes King Jehoiakim sitting in his winter apartments in the 9th month, which corresponds to the freezing, rainy month of December in Jerusalem. The text explicitly mentions the king sitting with a fire burning in a hearth right in front of him to keep warm.
And sure enough, when archaeologists excavated the throne rooms of the Bit Helani palaces at Zincirli, they found the remains of permanent stone hearths built right into the floor directly in front of the raised throne dais.
That is so cool.
At Tel Halaf, they even found a beautiful, ornate metal brazier, essentially an ancient space heater shaped like a cart on wheels designed to be rolled around the throne room.
The physical, mundane realities of ancient royal life described in the Bible align perfectly with the dirt.
They really do.
But this alignment brings up a really fascinating tension, one that often causes people to push back a bit.
Right.
Why would the God of the Bible, who constantly demands absolute separation from the pagan practices of the surrounding nations, allow his holy kings, David and Solomon, to use architectural blueprints that were identical to those used by pagan, Aramean, Syrian, and Canaanite kings?
It's a valid question.
Like, why does the holy palace of Yahweh's anointed king look exactly like a pagan Bit Helani?
It is an excellent question, and resolving it requires understanding how culture and technology actually operate.
Okay, lay it on me.
The historical framework reminds us that the physical vessels of any given era, the tools, the architecture, the clothing, they share a universal cultural language.
Right.
If you were building a monumental palace in the Iron Age Levant, whether you were an Israelite in Jerusalem or an Aramean in Damascus, you use the best architectural technology available in the Iron Age.
So a portico with columns is just a structurally sound, impressive way to build an entrance.
Exactly.
And high-end cedar paneling is just the universally agreed upon interior design trend for wealthy monarchs of that time period.
Exactly. The physical walls, the rock-cut moats, the Bit Helani layout, these all utilize the shared cultural and engineering language of the ancient Near East.
Right, it's just the style of the time.
But from the biblical perspective, it is a spiritual activity contained within those walls that set Jerusalem utterly apart from Damascus or Babylon. The worship of the one true God, the adherence to the Torah, the pursuit of divine justice within that hall of judgment, that is what made the space holy, not the geometry of its floor plan or the style of its fireplaces.
So we have spent a lot of time looking at walls designed to keep physical, flesh and blood enemies out, Canaanites, Assyrians, Babylonians.
Right.
But as we move forward in history and step into the Middle Ages, the historical record reveals that people believed there were literal physical walls out in the world designed to keep out a much darker, supernatural, apocalyptic threat.
No, this part is wild. We're shifting now into the bizarre, terrifying, and deeply fascinating intersection of biblical prophecy and medieval cartography.
Yep. We're looking at how people in the Middle Ages tried to map the end of the world.
We are talking about the legend of Gog and Magog.
To understand the sheer terror these names evoked in the medieval mind, we have to look at the source text, the book of Revelation, chapter 20. The scripture prophesies a time when, after 1,000 years, Satan will be released from his prison to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog.
And he will gather them together.
An army whose number is like the sand of the sea for a final cataclysmic battle against the holy city. The Old Testament prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah also speak of these terrifying entities bringing destruction from the far north.
Well, the phrase, the four corners of the earth, is a poetic idiom, right? It just means the extreme, unknown edges of existence.
Yeah, exactly. But medieval people were intensely literal. They didn't want a vague, poetic direction. They wanted coordinates.
They wanted to know exactly where the armies of the apocalypse were currently waiting.
The ancient Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, was one of the first to try and identify them historically. He associated Magog with the Scythians.
And we really need to explain who the Scythians were, because they were the boogeymen of the ancient world. The Scythians were a vast, terrifying empire of nomadic warriors who dominated the Eurasian steppes. They were master horse archers.
To the settled, agricultural civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Scythians represented pure, unstoppable, barbaric chaos.
They drank the blood of their enemies, they struck without warning, and they couldn't be conquered because they had no cities to besiege.
So, associating the apocalyptic horde of Magog with the terrifying reality of the Scythian horsemen made perfect sense.
Absolutely.
And as the centuries rolled on, medieval European scholars began plotting these horrific tribes onto their world maps, known as Mappamundi.
We are looking at magnificent, hand-drawn maps, like the famous Catalan Atlas from 1375, Ranulph Higden's map from around 1350, and Andrea Bianco's map from 1436.
And what you see on these maps is a wild collision of biblical prophecy, ancient geography, and one of the most popular mythological stories of the medieval era.
The legends of Alexander the Great.
Yes. There was this hugely popular, highly fictionalized collection of stories known as the Alexander Romance, circulating widely around 300 CE.
Translated into dozens of languages.
Yeah. The legend claimed that when Alexander the Great marched his conquering army east into the towering, impenetrable peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, he encountered a peaceful people who were being relentlessly harassed and slaughtered by the monstrous, cannibalistic empires of Gog and Magog to the north.
So according to the romance, Alexander does what any mythological hero would do. He builds a wall.
Obviously.
He finds a narrow pass between two massive mountains, and he commands his engineers to construct an impossibly massive gate made of iron and adamantine, a mythical, unbreakable metal.
He essentially locks the armies of the apocalypse behind a physical door.
This legend was incredibly pervasive. It likely originated from distorted rumors of the real historical Caspian Gates of Derbent, a massive defensive fortification complex built by the Sassanid Persian Empire in the 6th century to keep northern nomadic tribes out of Persia.
Right, but the medieval imagination took those real Persian walls and credited them to Alexander, transforming them into the literal lock on the door of the biblical apocalypse.
The legend was so culturally dominant that it even made its way into Islamic theology. The Quran contains a narrative about a great righteous ruler called Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, widely understood by historians to be a reference to Alexander,
who travels to a distant land and builds a great wall of iron and molten copper to pen in the infernal armies of Ya'juj and Ma'juj until the Day of Judgment.
So when a medieval monk or king unrolled a mappamundi like the Catalan Atlas, they weren't just looking at trade routes or the shapes of continents.
No, they were charting the eschatological timeline. The Catalan Atlas places Gog and Magog prominently in the extreme northeast corner of Asia, heavily enclosed by the jagged peaks of the Caspian Mountains.
The details drawn on these maps are just pure nightmare fuel.
They really are. The Catalan Atlas literally shows the great lord of Gog and Magog mounted on a massive horse surrounded by a dark horde. His followers are carrying black banners painted with horrifying images of the devil.
And the captions written next to the drawings on these maps are designed to induce dread. They explicitly state things like, "He will come at the time of Antichrist with a great following."
And they describe the enclosed tribes as savages who have no scruples about eating any kind of raw flesh, including human flesh.
It paints a picture of a horde waiting to devour Christendom.
It even shows Alexander the Great using psychological warfare. The map depicts Alexander placing two massive bronze, trumpet-shaped statues on top of the iron wall.
The wind would blow through these statues, creating a terrifying, constant howling sound, which tricked the tribes inside into thinking the wall was heavily guarded by demons, terrifying them into staying behind the gates.
It is a breathtaking synthesis of Greek mythology, Persian engineering, and biblical end-times theology.
And as the map-making progressed, the cartography get even more confused and panicked.
How so?
Maps like Andrea Bianco's began conflating the tribes of Gog and Magog with the 10 lost tribes of Israel, or with the Tartars, the Mongol hordes that had recently devastated Eastern Europe, or even drawing them on an isolated peninsula jutting out into a boiling ocean.
You know, when I look at these maps, I immediately think of modern world building in epic fantasy novels.
Oh, totally.
The most obvious comparison is Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin created a world where a massive magical wall of ice in the extreme north holds back a literal army of the dead, the White Walkers.
It's the exact same trope.
As modern consumers of fiction, we love that trope. But what is so mind-bending to realize is that the medieval people looking at the Catalan Atlas believed this was absolute, terrifying geographical reality.
They genuinely believed a physical iron wall somewhere in the mountains of Asia was the only thing preventing the biblical apocalypse from washing over their towns.
Exactly. And from a theological and psychological perspective, this mapping of Gog and Magog perfectly illustrates a fundamental flaw in human nature.
We are desperate to put a physical location on spiritual evil.
Right. We want to be able to point to a spot on a map, draw a wall around it, and say, the evil is over there, in the north, behind that iron gate.
It gives us a false, comforting sense of control over our apocalyptic dread. We think if we can map it, we can avoid it.
But the truth, as addressed in the New Testament, is that the most dangerous walls aren't located at the frozen edges of the world map. They are located right in the middle of our communities, right inside our own hearts.
Which brings us to the writings of the Apostle Paul, who tackled a much more insidious wall, one that Jesus Christ had to shed his blood to destroy.
We are turning now to the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 14. Paul is writing to a diverse church made up of people from radically different backgrounds, and he makes a staggering claim about Jesus.
He writes, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility."
The dividing wall of hostility. Some translations call it the wall of separation. Paul is talking about the intense, deeply ingrained, and often violent enmity that existed between the Jewish people and the Gentiles, the non-Jewish nations of the Roman world.
To fully grasp the weight and the shock value of Paul's statement, we have to unpack both the literal and the spiritual contexts of this wall.
Okay, let's start with the spiritual.
Spiritually, we have to go all the way back to the book of Exodus, chapter 19. God deliberately set the nation of Israel apart from the surrounding cultures. He gave them a highly specific framework of moral, civil, and ceremonial laws designed to make them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
Their dietary laws, their clothing, their calendar, all of it was designed to create a distinct boundary of holiness.
But it's crucial to note that this boundary was never supposed to be a wall of hatred.
No, not at all. The Old Testament is full of Gentiles who turned to the God of Israel, people like Rahab the Canaanite, Ruth the Moabite, or Naaman the Syrian, and they were welcomed in.
The Torah explicitly commanded the Israelites to treat the foreigner living among them with dignity and justice, reminding them that they themselves were once foreigners in Egypt.
However, human nature corrupts divine intent. Over the centuries, that divine calling to spiritual separation morphed into an ugly, toxic cultural superiority.
By the first century, many within the Jewish religious establishment viewed the surrounding Gentiles not just as different, but as inherently ritually impure.
Interacting with them, eating with them, or entering their homes was seen as a defilement. The separation had become weaponized.
And that spiritual toxicity didn't just stay in their minds, it manifested into a massive, literal, physical wall of stone.
Right in the heart of Jerusalem.
Yes. In the courtyard of the magnificent Second Temple, rebuilt by Herod, there was an actual barricade called the Soreg. It was a stone balustrade that separated the outer court of the Gentiles from the inner, sacred courts of the temple.
And this wasn't just a polite suggestion to stay out. Archaeologists have actually discovered the warning stones that were embedded into this wall.
They were engraved with massive Greek and Latin letters, explicitly warning that any Gentile who crossed that barrier into the inner courtyard would have only themselves to blame for their ensuing death.
It was a literal wall of lethal hostility.
Paul knew the deadly reality of this wall intimately. In the book of Acts, chapter 21, Paul is viciously attacked by a mob in the temple courts.
Why?
Because a rumor spread that he had brought a Gentile named Trophimus past that very wall into the restricted zone. The mob literally dragged Paul out and was in the process of beating him to death before the Roman garrison intervened.
Paul almost died because of the dividing wall of hostility.
So when Paul writes to the Ephesians that Jesus Christ has destroyed the barrier, he is making a revolutionary, earth-shattering theological claim.
And the Christian conservative view emphasizes that Christ's perfect sacrifice on the cross fulfilled all the righteous requirements of the Old Testament law.
In doing so, he rendered that rigid, exclusionary ethnic wall completely obsolete.
Christ's stated purpose was to take the two warring factions and create one new humanity in himself, establishing a profound supernatural peace.
It is the ultimate fulfillment of the beautiful prophecies found in the books of Isaiah and Micah, which envision all the nations of the earth streaming together up to the mountain of the Lord.
In Christ, the vicious tribalism, the nationalistic pride, the ethnic divisions, all the superficial things human beings use to build walls between each other are completely superseded by a new, eternal, spiritual brotherhood.
And historical accounts provide us with a truly beautiful physical illustration of this theological concept, utilizing the architecture of the Roman Empire.
Specifically, we look at the fate of the massive border walls built in Britain, Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall.
This is one of my favorite historical ironies.
Mine too. The Emperor Hadrian was not a friend to the biblical God or his people. In 135 CE, Hadrian brutally crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt, a massive Jewish uprising in Judea.
His response was devastating. He leveled Jerusalem, plowed it under, and rebuilt it as a pagan Roman colony, renaming it Aelia Capitolina, to completely erase its Jewish identity.
He even went so far as to build a grand pagan temple dedicated to the goddess Venus directly over the site that early Christians venerated as the tomb of Jesus.
In a deliberate attempt to stamp out the physical memory of Christianity, Hadrian was a master builder of physical and cultural walls of suppression and separation.
And on the other side of the known world, in northern England, he built his most famous monument, Hadrian's Wall.
It was a staggering military fortification stretching from coast to coast, designed to separate the civilized Roman province of Britannia from the wild barbarians of Scotland to the north.
It was guarded by thousands of legionaries. It was a literal towering wall of hostility, exclusion, and warfare.
But history, under the sovereignty of time, has a remarkable sense of poetic justice. Fast forward a few centuries, the Roman Empire collapses.
The invincible legions abandon their posts and leave Britain.
Hadrian's massive military machine falls into disrepair and is abandoned to the wind and the rain.
And what do the local people do with it? The local believers, the early Christians living in the Tyne Valley and along the frontier, looked at this massive, crumbling monument to a Roman military might, and they started quietly dismantling it.
They prized the perfectly squared, masterfully cut Roman ashlar stones out of Hadrian's Wall, put them on carts, and recycled them.
They used those stones to build early Christian churches and monasteries across the north of England. The physical remnants of those recycled Roman stones can still be seen in the masonry of ancient church walls today.
They literally took the stones from a weapon of war built by a pagan emperor who hated their faith and tried to erase their savior, and they repurposed them to build sanctuaries of peace, worship, and community.
It is the perfect, tangible embodiment of Paul's words in Ephesians 2:14. God takes the dividing walls of hostility that humanity violently constructs, and he gracefully repurposes them into sanctuaries of unity.
It's a powerful theological reminder. While Christians are called to maintain strong internal walls of holiness, to separate themselves from sin, they must aggressively resist and dismantle the walls of ethnic or social hostility between people.
Walls that Christ has already bled to tear down.
Exactly.
We have seen ancient mud brick walls flattened into the dirt at Jericho. We've seen Nehemiah painstakingly rebuild the burnt gates of Jerusalem. We've seen medieval monks try to map the iron walls of the apocalypse, and early British Christians dismantle the walls of the Roman Empire.
But what about the walls in our modern era?
Right. Do these ancient spiritual paradigms still apply to the concrete and steel of the 20th century?
To answer that, we turn to the climax of the Cold War. We are looking at a structure that, from a Christian perspective, perfectly and horrifyingly illustrates the insidious, evolving nature of sin.
We are talking about the Berlin Wall.
November 9, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall is one of the most iconic moments in modern history.
The wall had been built 58 years prior, physically severing the great city of Berlin and brutally dividing the nation of Germany in half, separating families, lovers, and friends for decades.
The historical and theological analysis we are examining here posits a profound thesis. The Berlin Wall is not just a relic of the Cold War. It is the perfect modern parable for the biblical concept of sin.
By analyzing how the wall was built, how it evolved, and how it eventually fell, we can extract 3 highly specific spiritual lessons about how sin operates in the human heart.
Let's break those down. Lesson 1 is about deception and separation. And the story of the Berlin Wall starts with a massive, bald-faced lie.
Right. In June of 1961, the political situation in East Germany was deteriorating rapidly. Millions of people were fleeing the communist regime by crossing into West Berlin.
So at a major press conference, Walter Ulbricht, the leader of East Germany, was asked directly if he planned to seal the border.
And he emphatically and indignantly stated to the global press, no one has the intention of erecting a wall.
Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer zu errichten. It became one of the most infamous quotes of the 20th century because it was a complete, calculated deception.
Just 2 months later, Ulbricht himself signed the secret order. And as we described at the very beginning of this deep dive, they moved with terrifying speed.
Under the cover of darkness, on August 12th and 13th, the military severed the city. They tore up the tram lines, they blocked the streets with concrete, and they unrolled thousands of miles of barbed wire.
West Berlin was completely walled off while the citizens slept.
And the official government propaganda explaining the wall was absolutely wild. They officially named it the Anti-Fascist Protective Wall.
They blasted propaganda over loudspeakers, telling the East German citizens that this wall was built out of love to protect them, to keep the corrupt fascist Westerners out.
But everyone living there knew the horrific truth. It wasn't a shield, it was a cage. It was a prison designed solely to keep East Germans in.
The theological framework connects this historical deception directly to the fundamental nature of sin, citing passages like James 1.4:15 and Isaiah 59.2.
Sin is, by its very design, highly deceptive. It never announces itself as a prison. It often presents itself as a protective wall, as something harmless, inviting, or even beneficial to your happiness or security.
It's exactly like signing up for one of those incredibly shady free trial subscriptions on the internet.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
You see an ad for a service and it says, try it absolutely free for 30 days, but they require you to put in your credit card information. You rationalize it thinking, I'm just getting something great for free. I'll cancel before they charge me.
But what you don't realize is that they've deliberately buried the cancellation button behind a dozen impossible broken links on their website.
And their customer service phone line is perpetually disconnected. It was never a free gift. The entire architecture of the offer was a trap designed to lock you into a recurring payment you can't escape.
That is the precise mechanism of temptation. It looks harmless, it promises a benefit, but overnight, it builds a concrete barrier between you and freedom.
The prophet Isaiah says, your iniquities have separated you from your God. Sin, exactly like the Berlin Wall, promises protection or pleasure, but its true hidden function is captivity and separation.
Which leads directly to lesson 2. It only gets harder to leave. The wall that the world watched fall on television in 1989 was absolutely not the same wall that Walter Ulbricht built in 1961.
No, it evolved into a monster. The 1961 wall was incredibly crude. It was hastily stacked cinder blocks, ripped up cobblestones, and coils of barbed wire. People could and did jump over it in those early days.
But the East German government couldn't tolerate the escapes. So over its nearly 30-year lifespan, the wall underwent 4 distinct massive renovations.
And we really need to explain the mechanics of what this wall became, because calling it a wall doesn't capture the horror of it. It evolved from a fence into a massive, highly militarized, overlapping fortress system.
The final iteration, known as the Border Wall 75, was a technological nightmare oppression. It wasn't just a wall, it was a massive scar across the city known as the Death Strip.
First, you had a massive concrete wall facing East Berlin. If you managed to scale that, you didn't reach the west. You dropped down into a vast, barren corridor of sand.
The sand was perfectly raked every single day, right?
Yeah.
Not for aesthetics, but so that any footprint of an escaping citizen would be immediately visible to the guards.
Exactly. And inside that death strip, there were tripwires connected to flare guns to illuminate escapees at night. There were deep trenches designed specifically to trap vehicles trying to ram through.
There were hundreds of vicious guard dogs on long-running leashes. There were over 300 watchtowers manned by guards who were given explicit written orders to shoot to kill anyone attempting to cross.
And finally, if you survived all of that, you faced a 12-foot-high reinforced concrete wall topped with a smooth pipe so you couldn't get a grip to pull yourself over.
The spiritual parallel here is stark and terrifying. The longer you stay in a pattern of unaddressed sin, the more entrenched, sophisticated, and deadly it becomes.
The writer of Hebrews warns against the sin which so easily ensnares us. A small moral compromise, a tiny lie, a hidden habit at first. It's just a strand of barbed wire. You think you can step over it whenever you want.
But if left unchecked, that habit gets reinforced. The rationalizations get stronger. And before long, what started as a simple, easily avoidable mistake has been renovated into a towering, militarized concrete fortress in your life that feels utterly impossible to escape.
The cage gets stronger every year you live in it. But escape is possible. Which brings us to the final point, Lesson 3, the Jericho moment.
Over the life of the Berlin Wall, approximately 5,000 people miraculously managed to escape to the west. They dug tunnels, they hid in modified car trunks, they flew over in hot air balloons.
And every single one of them had to risk absolutely everything, their lives, their families, to do it. Breaking free from an entrenched fortress of sin requires a decisive, courageous, often painful first step of action.
And the way the wall ultimately fell on a macro level is incredibly moving, and it connects directly back to our very first story of Jericho.
The Berlin Wall, this impenetrable fortress of Soviet military might, was not brought down by NATO artillery. It wasn't destroyed by a massive tank invasion. It was a modern, spiritual Jericho moment.
It started with the quiet, persistent movement of prayer, specifically the Monday demonstrations. These were peaceful protests that originated from weekly prayer meetings for peace held at the St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig, East Germany.
In the beginning, it was just a small handful of believers gathering to pray for freedom.
But it grew. Week by week, the faith and the peaceful resistance swelled. The state police tried to intimidate them, but they kept marching in peace.
By October of 1989, hundreds of thousands of citizens were in the streets holding candles, demanding freedom, and chanting, "We are the people."
The sheer moral weight of the peaceful crowds overwhelmed the heavily armed regime. The psychological pressure on the government became insurmountable.
And on the night of November 9th, 1989, due to a highly confused, bungled press conference by an East German official who mistakenly announced that travel restrictions were lifted immediately, the gates were suddenly flooded by thousands of East Berliners.
The border guards, completely overwhelmed and lacking clear orders to fire on such massive, peaceful crowds, simply stood down and opened the barriers.
Just like Jericho, the walls came down not by human military might, but by the persistent, unyielding march of faithful people. The people literally climbed on top of the wall with sledgehammers and pickaxes and began tearing it apart piece by piece, weeping and celebrating.
It is one of the most profound historical moments of the modern era. And just 4 months later, the famous Christian evangelist Billy Graham traveled to Berlin.
He stood and preached right at the Brandenburg Gate with the shattered concrete of the wall behind him.
He delivered a powerful theological message to the crowd, stating that while human walls, no matter how terrifying or heavily guarded, inevitably fall to the sands of time, only Jesus Christ has the divine power to break down the ultimate wall, the entrenched wall of sin and separation in the human heart.
The theological framework here leaves the listener with a deeply encouraging application. The wall of sin separating you from God doesn't need to stand for 30 agonizing years like the Berlin Wall did.
It doesn't need to go through 4 deadly renovations. Thanks to the completed sacrifice of Christ, that wall can come down immediately today.
The gates are open. You just have to be willing to take that decisive first step of faith to walk through them.
We have covered an incredible, expansive amount of ground today. We have traversed thousands of years of human history and theological development.
We really have. Let's recap this massive journey and connect these ideas. We started by marching in agonizing disciplined silence around the Bronze Age walls of Jericho, watching how obedient faith can turn towering mud bricks into a literal ramp of victory.
We sat in the ashes and wept with Nehemiah, learning the grueling logistics and the profound necessity of weeping concern required to rebuild the spiritual gates of our own lives.
We analyzed the topography of Jerusalem and the architecture of King Solomon's palace, seeing how a universal cultural language like the Bit Halani can be repurposed for divine worship.
We examined the terrifying apocalyptic maps of medieval monks, realizing that putting a physical wall around Gog and Magog is just a vain attempt to control our own spiritual dread.
We rejoiced at the tearing down of the Ephesian dividing wall, watching ancient Christians brilliantly recycle the stones of Roman military forts into places of worship and unity.
And finally, we watched the concrete of the Iron Curtain crumble, realizing that the most dangerous walls aren't made of rebar and death strips, but of deception and unconfessed sin.
But as we conclude, there is one final wall in the biblical narrative that we haven't discussed yet, and it serves as the ultimate sweeping conclusion to this entire duality of walls.
We find it at the very end of the biblical text in the book of Revelation, chapter 21.
John's vision of the New Jerusalem.
Yes, the Apostle John, exiled on the island of Patmos, describes a breathtaking vision of the heavenly city descending at the end of time, after all the wars and tears of human history have ceased.
And this city has a wall, a massive, great, and high wall.
But unlike the walls of Jericho, or ancient Jerusalem, or the death strip of Berlin walls that were built out of intense fear to keep out invaders or to imprison citizens, This eternal wall is entirely, fundamentally different in its nature.
The architectural description is staggering. The text says it is not built of mud brick or cold concrete, but of brilliant precious stones: jasper, sapphire, emerald, topaz, and amethyst. It radiates light.
But the most vital detail is its function. It has 12 gates, but Revelation 21.25 explicitly declares that its gates will never be shut. Day or night, they remain wide open.
Because in this redeemed city, there is no more night, there's no more deception, and there are absolutely no more enemies to fear.
This final, ultimate wall doesn't symbolize exclusion, hostility, or captivity. It stands forever as a beautiful monument to perfect, eternal safety and the ultimate unending peace of God's presence.
It is the final, beautiful redemption of the very concept of a wall. It transforms from a brutal barrier of fear into a radiant embrace of safety. So, as you go through your week, I want to leave you with this final thought to mull over. Take a hard, honest look at the architecture of your own life. Which walls currently standing are built out of hostility, tribalism, or deceptive sin, and urgently need to be torn down by an act of faith?
And conversely, which vital spiritual boundaries, like the walls in Nehemiah's day, have fallen into ruin through apathy and desperately need your weeping concern to be rebuilt?
The stones are laid out before you. The choice to march, to rebuild, or to step bravely through the open gate is ultimately yours.
That wraps it up for this deep dive. Thanks for watching A Moment in Time podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe.